On Yom Kippur morning 10 years ago, I gave a sermon where I discussed the fact that I own a set of books which crossed the Atlantic Ocean 5 times. Briefly, this is a set of Malbim's commentary on the prophets, which was published in Warsaw in the 1880s. They belonged to my great-grandfather, Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak Arian. They crossed the Atlantic for the first time when he immigrated to the United States from Ilya, Lithuania in the early 1900s. Although my great-grandfather was an Orthodox rabbi, there was no other kind in their shtetl. He was also a maskil, an enlightened one. My great-aunt Tante Malka told me that when she was in high school in Ilya, she read Les Miserables in Hebrew. Something that surely would not have been on the curriculum of a more traditional yeshiva. When my great-grandfather died, these books were inherited by my grandfather. When he died 4 years before I was born, neither my father nor his older brother had any use for them, since while they could read Hebrew, they did not have a sufficient Jewish education to understand what they were reading. But we had a cousin in our family, Michael Klein, who had grown up in an ultra-Orthodox milieu, and at the time he was studying in the Mir Yeshiva, so the books were passed on to him. At some point, Michael asked a question that the head of the yeshiva considered heretical, and he was told, "We don't ask those kinds of questions here." So Michael packed his bags, and he left not only the yeshiva, but Jewish observance. He enrolled in a PhD program at the University of Pennsylvania, and he eventually became the world's greatest expert on Targumim, rabbinic translations of biblical books from Hebrew to Aramaic. Although Michael left observance, he did not leave the Jewish people. He made Aliyah, married a native Israeli woman, and had 4 children. One of them, my cousin Matan Klein, is one of Israel's greatest jazz musicians. Eventually, he became the dean of the Jerusalem campus of Hebrew Union College, which is how we met, and eventually discovered that we were cousins. One Shabbat, as he was browsing his library, he discovered the set of Malbim with my great-grandfather's name written in them, and he decided that they should be returned to me. So they crossed the ocean once more, this time in my possession. A few years later, I brought them back to Israel. While I actually thought I might stay in Israel permanently, it was not to be. So they crossed the ocean again for their 5th and final time, at least so far, when I came back to the States after 2 years. What occurs to me now, 10 years after having given that sermon, is that those books and their journeys represent in some ways the course of modern Jewish history. Traditional shtetl, migration to the States, ultra-Orthodoxy, progressive Jewish religiosity, Israeli secularism. Very different forms of Jewish identity, but all playing their part in the story of our people. What does the Jewish story look like today in the wake of October 7th, 2023? 3 days ago, Rabbi Danny Gordis wrote a column about the Israeli musician Yishai Ribo, who incidentally, a few weeks ago, sold out Madison Square Garden. Yishai Ribo is Orthodox, but his music crosses a lot of boundaries, particularly his reworking of Seder Avodah, the service of the high priest on Yom Kippur, which is heard on Israeli pop radio constantly. Gordis says that this border crossing is extremely important in the post-October 7th Israeli reality. Here's what he writes. What he and others are doing is blurring boundaries between the world of the religious and the secular, which is not really secular, to beckon to everyone. This isn't the province of the religious, he's essentially saying. This is all of us. By making the Yom Kippur prayer into something that is played on regular radio stations, Ribo dismantles the supposed boundaries between classical and modern, religious and secular, liturgy and prose. And why does that matter now more than ever before? Because this year, Yom Kippur will be very different even from Rosh Hashanah last week. Since Rosh Hashanah just a week ago, thousands of soldiers have been called up. People who were in our community last week are in Lebanon this week. And this has been going on for a long, long year. All across the Israeli press and Israeli social media, one can see the signs of a nation increasingly exhausted, cracks beginning to appear. They're not huge yet, and perhaps they won't become huge, but they could. What does all of that have to do with Yishai Ribo? For us to persevere, to hang on as long as it takes, this is a country that is going to need to plumb the depths of faith, a faith that many people here did not examine before. It doesn't have to be religious faith necessarily, but it has to be faith in something. History, destiny, home, peoplehood. Pride in Israel as a startup nation with a booming economy in which Tel Aviv was essentially a Hebrew-speaking European city was great when the cost wasn't this high. But now the cost is sky high, and it could go higher. Why then, people will inevitably ask, does it matter? Why stay? Why raise children here? What is this place all about? That's the conversation that one can hear more and more Israelis having, not as a way of saying that Israel doesn't matter, but rather as searching for meaning, for rootedness, for a sense that we're the continuation of something sacred, regardless of how we define sacred. That's why the Avodah service on Israeli radio matters. That's why mixed Yom Kippur worship in Tel Aviv religious and secular, matters. It's why all the other musicians blurring these lines and making Jewish tradition part of the life of secular Israelis matters. And in terms of what Rabbi Gordis is talking about, mixed worship in Tel Aviv, every Saturday night, Motzei Shabbat, there's a Havdalah service in Kikar Hatufim, Hostage Square in Tel Aviv. And my cousin Matan, who I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, very often plays for that Havdalah service. And this idea of a Havdalah service as part of a social protest, right? This is a new phenomenon in Israel, which was up until very recently rigidly divided between religious and secular. But Rabbi Gordis points out, and correctly in my opinion, that so-called secular Israelis are reclaiming Jewish tradition, but on their own terms. That it doesn't only belong to the Orthodox or the ultra-Orthodox, but Judaism belongs to all of us. Now, what about Jewish life here in the United States after October 7th? Okay, and if you have not read Bret Stephens' New York Times column from last week, The Year That American Jews Woke Up, I would urge you to do so. Okay, and for those of us who maybe wonder, do miracles still exist? If you know what Bret Stephens stands for, and you know what I stand for, the fact that I am quoting at length from Bret Stephens is in and of itself, frankly, a small miracle. But I found his article. I didn't agree with everything in it, but I agreed with a lot of it, and it's important reading. So, Stephens says, and I agree with him here, that he's always believed that America was different. Okay, and that's one of the themes that I've hit on year after year in many of my sermons, right? That this is, in most countries in the world, a Jew will never be really French. A Jew will never, ever, ever be really French or really British, right? But up until recently, the only people who said that we Jews are not really American were fringe, marginal characters, right? And sadly, the group of people who say that real Americans are Christian, real Americans are white, and by those people we Jews are not white, that group is growing. That group is growing, and it's a danger, and it's something that we have to really watch out for. But Stephens says, despite this, despite the rise in anti-Semitism, although he finds it harder and harder to do so, he still believes that America is different. How to fight anti-Semitism is a tactical question. But he says there are larger strategic and perhaps moral ones. Namely, are we going to be proud Jews or mostly indifferent ones? And if proud, What does that entail? It's an open question that each of us will have to answer for ourselves. For my part, the answer goes something like this. To have been born a Jew is the single most fortunate thing that ever happened to me. It is a priceless moral, spiritual, intellectual, and emotional inheritance from my ancestors, some of whom were slaughtered for it. It's a precious bequest to my children, who will find different ways to make it their own. It is therefore worth the time it takes to explore and worth the cost, including tragically the cost in bigotry and violence it so often extracts. To be a Jew obliges us to many things, particularly our duty to be our brothers and sisters' keeper. That means never to forsake one another, much less to join in the vilification of our own people. It means to participate in the long struggle for our survival, not only against enemies who mean us harm, but also against those who excuse those enemies or those whose moral apathy speeds their way. And it means to embrace, often as a thoughtful critic, but never as a hateful scold. And this is where I think Gordis and Stevens come together. Be a thoughtful critic of Israel? Absolutely, right? I mean, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg once said, he's an Orthodox rabbi, he said, it doesn't matter which denomination of Judaism you belong to, as long as you're ashamed of it. And part of loving Israel is to be critical of it, right? Just like you have friends, relatives, people who you love, but when they're on the wrong path, you have to be critical of them, but a thoughtful critic, not a hateful scold. And so it means to embrace the great, complicated, essential project of a Jewish state. To imagine we can do without it is to forget how close we came to extinction before it was born. October 7th shook our illusions and reawakened us to where we stand as a diasporic community. Now we must reckon with who we are and what we must do. And that is the call and the opportunity of Yom Kippur. As we stand here together and during Mila, as we stand before the open ark, we each have the responsibility and the ability to decide who we are, who we want to be, and what path are we going to take in the coming year. Gemar Hatima Tova, Shabbat Shalom. May we be inscribed for blessing in the book of life. Amen.